The cold barrel of a revolver pressed against Pearl Zimmerman's temple as the stagecoach rumbled to a stop, and in that moment, she knew the decision to become a mail-order bride had been the worst mistake of her life. Nobody move. A gruff voice commanded as two masked men invaded the coach that had been carrying Pearl and 3 other passengers across the Kansas territory. The year was 1873, and Pearl had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston with nothing but a carpetbag of belongings and a letter promising marriage to a man she'd never met. "Jewelry and money in the bag," the second robber demanded, thrusting a burlap sack toward the elderly couple across from Pearl. The woman whimpered as she removed her wedding band, hands trembling. Pearl clutched her reticule tightly. Inside was all the money she had left in the world, $7.12 along with the letter from Mr. Elijah Thornton, her husband-to-be. The letter had painted him as a successful rancher in need of a wife, but his demands had grown increasingly disturbing with each correspondence. The final letter had contained a threat veiled as a wedding vow. "You will be mine to command, and disobedience will not be tolerated." The robber turned his attention to Pearl. "You too, pretty lady, everything in the bag." She hesitated, knowing surrender meant destitution. Before she could comply, gunshots rang out from outside the coach. The bandits whirled around in panic. "It's the Rangers," one shouted, firing blindly through the window. More shots followed. Pearl threw herself to the floor of the coach, covering her head. The elderly couple huddled together in terror while the 4th passenger, a traveling salesman, had fainted dead away. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Seconds stretched into a full minute of silence before the coach door was yanked open. Pearl flinched, expecting another bandit, but instead found herself looking up at a tall figure silhouetted against the bright Kansas sky. "Everyone all right in here?" The man's voice was deep but gentle, tinged with concern. "We're unharmed," the elderly gentleman replied shakily. The stranger leaned in, and Pearl could now see him clearly, a cowboy with sun-bronzed skin, dark hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of a summer storm. He extended a hand toward Pearl. "Madam, are you hurt?" Pearl shook her head, accepting his help. His hand was calloused but warm as he assisted her out of the coach. "The name's Deacon Adler," he said, releasing her hand once she stood safely on solid ground. "Those bandits have been troubling this route for months." Outside, Pearl saw one robber face down in the dirt, apparently wounded, while another was being tied to a tree by a man wearing a Texas Ranger badge. The driver of the stagecoach was tending to the horses, which had been spooked by the gunfire. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Adler," Pearl said, straightening her dusty traveling dress. "Just doing what needed doing," he replied with a slight tip of his hat. "Where you folks headed?" "I'm bound for Whispering Creek," Pearl answered. "I'm to meet my intended." The word felt bitter on her tongue. Something flickered in Deacon's expression, surprise, perhaps recognition. "Whispering Creek, you say? That's my destination as well. I run cattle about 10 miles outside of town." The ranger approached, nodding to Deacon. "We'll take these varmints to the territorial prison. Coach should be ready to continue in a few minutes." Pearl glanced nervously at the horizon. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the vast prairie in hues of gold and amber. Beautiful, but somehow ominous. "You look troubled, miss." Deacon said, "Zimmerman, Pearl Zimmerman." She hesitated, then admitted, "I'm having second thoughts about my arrangement. I'm a mail-order bride," she explained, the shame of it coloring her cheeks, "coming to marry Elijah Thornton." Deacon's posture stiffened visibly. "Thornton," he repeated, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. "You know him?" Pearl asked, her heart sinking. "Everyone in these parts knows Thornton." Deacon's jaw tightened. "Miss Zimmerman, I don't mean to alarm you, but Thornton isn't known for his kindness, especially to women." Pearl closed her eyes briefly, her worst fears confirmed. "His last wife disappeared under mysterious circumstances," Deacon continued in a lower voice. "Some say she ran off, others, well, they say different things." The stagecoach driver called out that they were ready to continue the journey. Pearl stood frozen, the future she dreaded now looming larger and more terrifying than ever. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. Deacon studied her for a long moment. I have a proposition for you, Miss Zimmerman, one that might solve both our problems. What sort of proposition? Pearl asked cautiously. A business arrangement. I need someone to keep house at my ranch, cook for the hands. It's respectable work with fair pay. He paused. And it would give you a reason to break your agreement with Thornton. Hope flickered in Pearl's chest, but suspicion quickly doused it. Why would you help a stranger this way? Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting to see Thornton disappointed, Deacon replied. And I've been looking for help at the ranch. The boys are tired of my cooking. Pearl weighed her options quickly. Continue to Thornton and his ominous threats, or take a chance on this stranger with storm-gray eyes who had already saved her once today. Driver, she called out, decision made. I've had a change of plans. The journey to Deacon's ranch took nearly 2 hours across open prairie. Pearl sat beside him on his wagon after declining to continue on the stagecoach. They traveled mostly in silence, Pearl too exhausted from the day's events to make conversation. Occasionally, Deacon would point out landmarks or name the wildflowers that carpeted the grasslands. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery streaks, a sprawling ranch house came into view. Behind it stood a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, all well-maintained if modest. Cattle dotted the distant pastures. It's not much, Deacon said as they approached, but it's home. It's beautiful, Pearl replied truthfully. After the cramped tenement she'd shared with 3 other working girls in Boston, the open space and solid buildings seemed luxurious. As they pulled up to the house, 3 men emerged from the bunkhouse, curious about the unexpected visitor. Boys, Deacon called out as he helped Pearl down from the wagon. This is Miss Pearl Zimmerman. She'll be taking over the cooking and keeping house. The men removed their hats respectfully. Deacon introduced them as Jorge, the oldest of the hands who'd been with him since the beginning, young Charlie, barely 20 with a perpetual smile, and Hank, a former soldier with a quiet demeanor. Miss Pearl will have the spare bedroom in the main house, Deacon informed them. I expect you all to show her proper respect. Yes, boss, they replied in near unison, though Pearl noted curious glances exchanged between them. Deacon carried Pearl's carpetbag inside. The house was simply furnished but clean, with a large kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and 3 bedrooms off a central hallway. This will be your room, Deacon said, setting her bag down in a modest but comfortable-looking chamber with a bed, dresser, and small writing desk. The privy's out back, and we have a bathhouse behind the kitchen. The boys heat water on Saturdays for baths. Thank you, Pearl said, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's rapid changes. Mr. Adler, Deacon, please, he interrupted. Deacon. I appreciate your kindness, but I should explain something. Pearl took a deep breath. I'm not much of a cook. I worked in a textile mill in Boston. I can manage basic meals, but nothing fancy. To her surprise, Deacon laughed. Miss Zimmerman, I've been eating my own cooking and Hank's for the past year. Trust me, you can only be an improvement. The tension in Pearl's shoulders eased slightly. I'll do my best, she promised. That's all I ask. He hesitated at the doorway. We rise at dawn. I'll show you around the kitchen tonight if you'd like to get your bearings. Pearl nodded, and after Deacon left, she sank onto the bed, letting out a long, shaky breath. She'd escaped one potentially dangerous situation only to place herself at the mercy of another stranger. But something about Deacon Adler inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he spoke to his men with respect, or how he'd stepped in during the robbery without hesitation. Still, she would need to be cautious, and she would need to face Thornton eventually. Breaking a marriage agreement was no small matter, even for a mail-order arrangement. Pearl knew men like Thornton didn't simply accept rejection. After washing up with the basin of water Deacon had brought, Pearl joined him in the kitchen. He showed her where everything was kept, from flour and coffee to pots and pans. The pantry was well stocked, and there was a root cellar accessible from outside for vegetables and preserved goods. The garden's out back, Deacon explained. Jorge's wife comes by twice a week to tend it. She'd be happy to show you what's ready for picking. Does she live nearby? Pearl asked, hopeful at the prospect of female companionship. About 3 miles east, they have their own small place. Jorge works here during the day and goes home at night. Deacon leaned against the counter. We're not completely isolated. Whispering creaks about an hour's ride. It's small, but there's a general store, a church, saloon, and a doctor who comes through once a month. Pearl nodded, taking it all in. And, Mr. Thornton, where is his property? Deacon's expression darkened. North of town, larger spread than mine. He's got about 30 hands working for him. Will he come looking for me, do you think? Eventually, Deacon admitted. But you're under no obligation to him. You never signed any papers, did you? Pearl shook her head. No, just exchanged letters. He sent train fare, which you can repay from your wages, Deacon said firmly. You're a free woman, Pearl, remember that. The use of her first name caught her attention. It sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. I should start supper, she said, changing the subject. Is there anything the men particularly like? Anything that isn't burned? Deacon replied with a wry smile. We've got beans, salt pork, and some biscuit fixings. That'll do for tonight. As Pearl began to work, Deacon excused himself to tend to the horses. Alone in the kitchen, she felt her anxiety begin to subside as she fell into the familiar rhythm of practical work. The meal she prepared was simple but edible, and the genuine appreciation from the ranch hands when they sat down to eat made her flush with unexpected pride. That night, lying in her new bed, Pearl stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. Exhaustion pulled at her, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind kept returning to Thornton and his threatening letters. What kind of man would she have found waiting at the end of her journey? And what would he do when he discovered she wasn't coming? More immediately, what kind of man was Deacon Adler? A handsome rescuer with a mysterious grudge against Thornton, offering shelter and employment to a woman he'd just met. It seemed too providential to be true. Pearl turned onto her side, watching moonlight filter through the simple curtains. Whatever his motivations, Deacon had given her something precious time. Time to think, to plan, to decide her own fate rather than rushing headlong into a dangerous situation. For that alone, she owed him her gratitude. The rest would have to be sorted out in the days to come. Dawn arrived with the crowing of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Pearl woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 serviceable dresses and hurried to the kitchen, determined to prove her worth from the start. She needn't have worried about rising early enough. Deacon was already up, stoking the fire in the stove. Good morning, he said, straightening up. Hope you slept well. Better than expected, Pearl admitted. I'll get breakfast started. Coffee's already brewing, he replied. The boys will be in soon. They like eggs if we have them and salt pork, biscuits when there's time. Pearl set to work, grateful that the stove was already hot. She found eggs in a basket by the back door freshly collected, she presumed, and soon had breakfast well underway. Deacon lingered, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. Is something wrong? She finally asked. He shook his head. Just thinking about how different the kitchen feels with you in it. Before Pearl could respond to this cryptic comment, the ranch hands arrived, bringing with them the smells of morning chores and hearty appetites. Breakfast was a quick, utilitarian affair, the men eager to begin their day's work. Charlie, show Miss Zimmerman where the wash line is, Deacon instructed as they finished eating, and make sure she knows how to work the pump. Yes, sir, Charlie replied, giving Pearl a shy smile. After the men departed, Pearl cleaned up breakfast and followed Charlie's instructions about the household amenities. She spent the morning exploring her new domain, the root cellar with its stores of potatoes and carrots, the smokehouse where hams and bacon hung, the chicken coop where a dozen hens clucked indignantly at her intrusion. By midday, she had bread rising on the kitchen table and a stew simmering for dinner. The physical work was a relief after the tension of the previous day, giving her hands purpose while her mind worked through her situation. When Deacon and the men returned for the noon meal, they brought news that set Pearl's heart racing. Thornton's men were in town this morning, Jorge reported as they ate. Asking about a stagecoach passenger who never arrived, Pearl's spoon clattered against her bowl. Deacon's eyes met hers across the table. How much do they know? He asked Jorge. Not much. Driver didn't tell them anything specific, just that all his passengers continued to their destinations. Jorge glanced apologetically at Pearl. But Thornton's not stupid. He'll figure it out eventually. Let him, Deacon said firmly. Miss Zimmerman has made her choice. She's under my protection now. The words should have been reassuring, but they sent a chill down Pearl's spine. Protection implied danger, and danger there certainly was. She'd known Thornton wouldn't simply accept her disappearance, but the reality of his searching for her made the threat immediate and tangible. After the men returned to work, Pearl busied herself with laundry, scrubbing shirts and denims with more force than necessary. The physical exertion helped channel her anxiety, but her mind kept returning to the problem at hand. She couldn't hide forever. Eventually, she would have to face Thornton and formally break their agreement. Late in the afternoon, as Pearl was hanging the last of the laundry, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she saw Deacon riding in from the east pasture at a gallop. He reined in hard by the corral, dismounted in one fluid motion, and strode toward her with purpose in every step. "We have a problem," he announced without preamble. "Thornton's coming. Jorge's wife just rode over to warn us. He's gathering men." Pearl's blood ran cold. "Coming here, why?" "Because the stagecoach driver talked after all." Deacon's expression was grim. "Thornton knows you're here." "What do we do?" Pearl asked, hating the tremor in her voice. "I've sent Charlie to round up some neighbors. We'll be ready if they try anything." Deacon took her arm gently. "Come inside. I need to tell you something before they arrive." In the kitchen, Deacon paced while Pearl sat rigidly at the table. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he began. "My interest in helping you wasn't purely charitable." "I suspected as much," Pearl replied quietly. "Thornton and I have history, bad history." Deacon stopped pacing, facing her directly. "My sister was his first wife," Pearl gasped softly. "The one who disappeared," Deacon nodded, his expression hardening. "Sarah. She wrote to me about his cruelty, but by the time I arrived from Colorado, she was gone. Thornton claimed she'd run off with a traveling salesman, but I never believed it." His hands clenched into fists. "I've spent 2 years trying to prove what he did to her, but he's careful, well-connected." "So when you saw me on that stagecoach," Pearl began, understanding dawning. "I recognized another of his victims before it was too late," Deacon finished. "I couldn't save Sarah, but I could at least spare you her fate." The revelation left Pearl speechless. Her instinct had been right. Deacon's offer hadn't been simple kindness, but the motivation behind it was far more complicated than she'd imagined. "I should have told you sooner," Deacon continued, "but I didn't want to frighten you more than you already were." Pearl absorbed this new information, emotions swirling: sympathy for Deacon's loss, fear of Thornton's approaching retribution, and uncertainty about her own role in their feud. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we stand our ground," Deacon replied. "Thornton has no legal claim on you. You haven't broken any laws by changing your mind." "But he'll be angry," Pearl said softly. "Men like that, they don't accept rejection easily." "No," Deacon agreed, "they don't, which is why we need to be prepared." He crossed to a cabinet and removed a small revolver. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Pearl shook her head. "It's simple enough. Point and pull the trigger. It's loaded, 5 rounds. He placed it on the table before her. "I hope you won't need it, but I want you to have it just in case." The weight of the weapon was terrifying. Pearl had never imagined herself capable of violence, but the thought of facing Thornton unarmed was worse. "Thank you," she said, carefully placing the revolver in her apron pocket. "But I hope it doesn't come to that." "So do I." Deacon's expression softened momentarily. "Pearl, I'm sorry I've drawn you into my quarrel with Thornton. That wasn't fair to you." "You saved me from a terrible fate," she replied. "I'm grateful despite the complications." Their eyes met across the table, a moment of understanding passing between them. Then Hank burst through the door, breathless. "They're coming," he announced. "About 8 riders led by Thornton himself. 5 minutes, maybe less." Deacon straightened, all vulnerability vanishing from his face. "Get Jorge. Both of you take positions by the barn. No shooting unless they start it, understood?" Hank nodded and disappeared. "Stay inside," Deacon told Pearl, his voice gentle but firm. "No matter what happens or what's said, stay inside until I come for you." Before Pearl could respond, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. She moved to the window, heart pounding, and watched as Deacon, Jorge, and Hank positioned themselves in the yard, rifles ready but not aimed. Minutes later, a group of riders appeared, dust billowing behind them as they approached the ranch house. From her vantage point, Pearl could see a tall man in the lead older than Deacon, wearing a black coat despite the heat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Even without seeing his features clearly, she knew instinctively this must be Elijah Thornton. The riders pulled up about 20 yards from where Deacon stood. Tension crackled in the air like the prelude to a lightning storm. Pearl cracked the window slightly, straining to hear the exchange. "Adler," Thornton called out, his voice carrying a false cordiality that made Pearl's skin crawl. "You have something that belongs to me." "No man owns a woman, Thornton," Deacon replied, his posture deceptively relaxed though Pearl could see the tension in his shoulders. "A business agreement was made," Thornton countered. "The lady accepted my money, promised herself to me. Where I come from, that's binding. Where I come from, a lady has the right to change her mind, especially when the man she's promised to has a history of making wives disappear." A dangerous silence followed this accusation. Even from a distance, Pearl could see Thornton's posture stiffen. "Still peddling that story, Adler. Your sister ran off. Everyone knows it." "Like hell she did," Deacon snapped, his composure cracking. Thornton dismounted slowly, deliberately, his men remaining on horseback. "I've been patient with your delusions of foul play, but my patience has limits. Now I've come for my bride. Send her out and we'll leave peacefully." "Miss Zimmerman isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Deacon replied. "She's made her choice. Respect it and ride out." "Not without what's mine." Thornton took a step forward. "Miss Zimmerman." He called out toward the house. "I've come to escort you to your new home. Don't let this man fill your head with lies." Pearl shrank back from the window, though she knew he couldn't see her through the glass. The sound of her name on his lips sent ice through her veins. Outside, the standoff continued. "She doesn't want to see you, Thornton," Deacon said. "Go back to your ranch, find another wife to terrorize." "I paid good money, which will be repaid," Deacon interrupted. "Every cent, now get off my land." For a long, tense moment, it seemed Thornton might back down. Then, with deliberate slowness, his hand moved toward his holster. "I tried being reasonable," he said. Before he could draw, the sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention. Charlie returned with reinforcements, 5 men on horseback, all armed. The odds had shifted. Thornton assessed the situation, clearly calculating his chances. Finally, he stepped back toward his horse. "This isn't over, Adler," he said, mounting smoothly. "Not by a long shot." "It is for today," Deacon replied evenly. With a curt nod to his men, Thornton wheeled his horse around. The group rode away, dust swirling in their wake, but not before Thornton called out a final warning. "Tell Miss Zimmerman I'll be waiting." A woman needs to honor her commitments in these parts, one way or another. Pearl watched them disappear into the distance, her hands trembling. The revolver in her pocket felt impossibly heavy. Deacon conferred briefly with Charlie and the men who'd come to their aid before heading back toward the house. When he entered the kitchen, Pearl was still standing by the window, pale but composed. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded. "He'll be back." "Yes." Deacon removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "But we'll be ready." "This can't go on indefinitely," Pearl said softly. "I can't hide behind your guns forever." "No," Deacon agreed. "We need a more permanent solution." Pearl sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "What kind of solution can there be? As long as I remain here, he'll see it as a provocation. As long as I'm unmarried, he'll believe he has a claim on me." Deacon went still, something shifting in his expression. "There is one way," he said slowly, "but it's a lot to ask." Pearl looked up, meeting his gaze. "What are you suggesting?" "Marriage," Deacon said simply. "Not to Thornton, to me." The word hung in the air between them. Pearl stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to marry me," she finally managed. "A marriage in name only," Deacon clarified quickly. "It would legally void your agreement with Thornton. He couldn't pursue you without breaking the law." "But we barely know each other," Pearl protested. "I know you're brave," Deacon replied. "I know you're hardworking. I know you deserve better than Thornton." He paused. "And you know I have my reasons for wanting to thwart him." Pearl stood, needing to move to think. "This is unexpected." "I understand if you refuse," Deacon said. "It's unconventional, to say the least. But it would solve the immediate problem. and create new ones, Pearl pointed out. What about when this is over, when Thornton gives up, or if you find proof of what happened to your sister? Would we simply dissolve the marriage? If that's what you wanted, Deacon said, his voice carefully neutral. I wouldn't hold you to anything beyond protection from Thornton. Pearl paced the small kitchen, mind racing. A marriage of convenience. It wasn't unheard of, especially on the frontier where practical considerations often outweighed romantic ones. And it would indeed solve her most pressing problem. But marriage, even in name only, was a serious commitment. And there was something in Deacon's eyes when he looked at her, something that suggested this proposal wasn't entirely pragmatic on his part. I need time to think, she finally said. Of course. Deacon replaced his hat. I should check the fences anyway. Those men rode across the south pasture. After he left, Pearl sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the day's events. A week ago, she had been a mill worker in Boston, dreaming of a fresh start in the West. Now she was at the center of a dangerous feud, with one man threatening her and another offering marriage as protection. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west to be a mail-order bride, only to find herself considering a different kind of arranged marriage altogether. But there was one crucial difference. Deacon had shown her nothing but respect since the moment they met. He'd offered her choices at every turn. Even this marriage proposal was presented as an option, not a demand. Perhaps that was what finally decided her. By the time Deacon returned at dusk, Pearl had made up her mind. She was stirring a pot of stew when he entered the kitchen, hat in hand, his expression guarded. I'll do it, she said without preamble. I'll marry you, Mr. Adler, on one condition. Name it, he replied, surprise and something like relief crossing his face. When this is over, when I'm truly free of Thornton's claims, we reassess. If either of us wishes to end the arrangement, we do so amicably. Deacon nodded slowly. That's more than fair. Then we have an agreement. Pearl extended her hand formally, as though sealing a business transaction. Deacon took it gently in his own. An agreement, he echoed, but his eyes held a warmth that belied the practical nature of their arrangement. The preacher comes to town every third Sunday, he continued, releasing her hand. That's 5 days from now, so soon. Pearl asked, though she knew delay only invited more trouble from Thornton. Better not to wait, Deacon confirmed. Thornton isn't the type to give up easily. That night, Pearl lay awake longer than usual, contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. Marriage to a virtual stranger, yet somehow, Deacon Adler felt less a stranger with each passing hour. There was a directness to him, a quiet integrity that inspired trust despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Still, she reminded herself firmly, theirs would be a marriage of convenience only, a practical solution to an immediate problem. Whatever attraction she might feel toward her soon-to-be husband was irrelevant to their arrangement. With that firmly in mind, Pearl finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of storm-gray eyes and gentle hands. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Pearl threw herself into her household duties with renewed determination, as though proving her worth as a housekeeper might somehow justify the unorthodox arrangement she'd agreed to. Deacon, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while ensuring the ranch was well guarded against any return visit from Thornton. On Friday, Deacon announced he would take Pearl into Whispering Creek to purchase supplies and introduce her to the community. Best to establish our story before Sunday, he explained. Fewer questions that way. The town was exactly as Deacon had described, small but vital, with a main street lined by a general store, saloon, small church, and assorted businesses. People nodded respectfully to Deacon as they passed, curious eyes taking in Pearl beside him. News travels fast, Deacon murmured as they entered the general store. Everyone already knows you're staying at the ranch. And what will they think when we marry so suddenly? Pearl asked quietly. That I'm the luckiest man in the territory, Deacon replied with an unexpected smile that warmed his usually serious features. The store owner, a jovial man named Peterson, greeted them warmly. Miss Zimmerman, I presume, we've heard Deacon finally found himself some proper help. And more, Deacon said, placing a hand lightly on Pearl's shoulder. "We'll be marrying on Sunday, Mr. Peterson. Thought you should be among the first to know." Peterson's eyebrows shot up, but he recovered quickly. "Well now, that's wonderful news. Congratulations to you both." He turned to select a small jar from a shelf behind him. Some of Mrs. Peterson's honey for the happy couple, on the house. Pearl managed to thank him through her surprise. Deacon's open declaration had caught her off guard. She'd expected more subterfuge, perhaps a private word with the preacher explaining their situation. After leaving the store with their supplies, they continued down the street. Pearl noticed the curious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped as they passed. "They're all talking about us," she whispered to Deacon. "Let them," he replied, unconcerned. "Better they discuss a wedding than speculate about why you're living unchaperoned at my ranch." He had a point. Still, Pearl felt exposed under the scrutiny of these strangers. They passed the saloon just as two men emerged, deep in conversation. One looked up, his expression darkening as he recognized Deacon. "Adler," he called out, "heard you're harboring Thornton's woman." Deacon stopped, his posture stiffening. "Miss Zimmerman isn't anyone's woman, Garrett. She's my fiancé." The man named Garrett snorted. "That's not how Thornton tells it." "Thornton can tell it however he likes," Deacon replied evenly. "The truth is Miss Zimmerman and I are to be married Sunday. You're welcome to attend if you doubt me." Garrett eyed Pearl assessingly. "Pretty little thing. No wonder Thornton's riled up. Never did like losing." Pearl stared back at him, refusing to be intimidated despite the churning in her stomach. "Come on," Deacon said quietly to Pearl, guiding her past the men. "Thornton won't take this lying down," Garrett called after them. "Man like that holds grudges." "Let's finish our errands," Deacon murmured to Pearl, ignoring the taunt. They visited the dressmaker next, where Deacon insisted on purchasing fabric for a proper wedding dress despite Pearl's protests that it wasn't necessary for their arrangement. "People will expect it," he explained simply. "And you deserve something nice for the occasion, practical or not." The seamstress, Mrs. Holloway, clucked over the tight time frame but promised the dress would be ready by Sunday morning. "Nothing too elaborate, but you'll be a beautiful bride," she assured Pearl. Their final stop was the small church at the end of the street. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, welcomed them warmly. "Deacon tells me you're to be married," he said to Pearl. "Rather sudden, isn't it?" "When you know, Reverend," Deacon replied before Pearl could answer. "We're hoping you can perform the ceremony after Sunday service." The Reverend studied them both carefully. "Marriage is a sacred covenant before God," he said slowly, "not to be entered into lightly or for worldly reasons." Pearl felt her cheeks flush. Did he suspect their arrangement wasn't born of genuine affection? "I assure you, Reverend, our intentions are honorable," Deacon said firmly. After a moment's consideration, the Reverend nodded. "Very well. After the service, then. I'll need to speak with each of you separately before Sunday, however. Premarital counseling is something I insist upon, even for expedited ceremonies." They agreed to return the following day for these conversations, then took their leave. As they walked back toward the wagon, Pearl couldn't help but ask, "What will you tell the Reverend tomorrow? About why we're marrying so quickly?" "The truth," Deacon replied, surprising her. "Or part of it, at least, that you came west to marry another man but found the arrangement unsuitable. That I offered an alternative, that we hope affection will grow with time." "And will he accept that?" Pearl asked doubtfully. The Reverend is a practical man. Despite his talk of sacred covenants, he understands frontier marriages are often based on mutual need as much as romance. Deacon helped her onto the wagon seat. "Besides, it's not entirely untrue, is it? You did come west as a mail-order bride, and found the arrangement unsuitable," Pearl agreed with a faint smile, "though your alternative was unexpected." "Life is full of unexpected turns," Deacon replied, climbing up beside her. "Some better than others." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in thought about the commitment they were about to make. As the house came into view, Pearl found herself studying it with new eyes. Soon this would be her home, not just as a housekeeper, but as Deacon's wife. The thought sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Deacon," she said suddenly, "after we're married, what will be expected of me?" He glanced at her, understanding the unasked question. "Nothing more than what you've already agreed to," he assured her. "I meant what I said about this being a marriage in name only. Your room remains your own." Relief and something that might have been disappointment mingled in Pearl's response. "Thank you for clarifying. Of course." He hesitated, then added more softly, "I would never press unwanted attentions on any woman, Pearl, especially not one who's already been put in a difficult position." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Whatever else might be uncertain about their arrangement, Pearl was increasingly convinced that Deacon Adler was a good man, perhaps a better man than she deserved after her foolish decision to become a mail-order bride in the first place. Saturday passed in a flurry of final preparations. Pearl rode back into town with Deacon for their separate meetings with Reverend Thomas, then collected her wedding dress from Mrs. Holloway. It was simple but lovely pale blue calico with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Not traditional white, Mrs. Holloway acknowledged, but more practical for frontier life, and the color suits your eyes. Pearl thanked her sincerely, touched by the woman's thoughtfulness despite the rushed nature of the order. That evening, as Pearl prepared dinner for what would be her last night as an unmarried woman, Jorge's wife Maria arrived with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For tomorrow," she explained in accented English, smiling warmly. "Every bride needs flowers." "Thank you," Pearl said, deeply moved by the gesture. "It's very kind of you." Maria stayed to help with dinner preparations, her cheerful chatter a welcome distraction from Pearl's growing nerves. As they worked side by side, Maria offered small insights into Deacon's character, how he had helped her and Jorge acquire their own small property, how he never raised his voice to his men, how he had once ridden through a blizzard to fetch the doctor when Charlie fell ill with fever. "He is a good man," Maria concluded as they set the table. "You will have a good life together." Pearl nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The genuine kindness she had encountered since arriving at the ranch from Deacon, from his men, from Maria stood in stark contrast to the threatening tone of Thornton's letters. Whatever else might come of this unusual marriage, she had at least escaped a truly terrible fate. Sunday dawned clear and mild, a perfect late spring day. Pearl woke early, too nervous to sleep, and spent an hour carefully styling her hair before donning her new dress. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above her dresser was familiar, yet changed, somehow more hopeful than she had seen herself look in a long time. A soft knock at her door startled her. "Pearl," Deacon called. "Are you ready? The wagon's hitched." "Just a moment," she replied, pinning Maria's wildflowers to her bodice with trembling fingers. When she emerged from her room, Deacon was waiting in the hallway. He wore his best clothes, a clean black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. For a moment, Pearl simply stared at him, struck by how handsome he looked. Deacon seemed equally affected by her appearance. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "Thank you," Pearl replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "You look quite handsome yourself." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Charlie called from outside that they should get going if they wanted to make the church service on time. The church was full when they arrived, the small community having turned out in force partly for Sunday worship, partly out of curiosity about Deacon Adler's sudden marriage. Pearl felt the weight of many eyes upon her as Deacon escorted her to a pew near the front. The service passed in a blur, Pearl barely registering the hymns or the sermon. Her mind was too occupied with what would follow the vows that would bind her to Deacon, at least for the foreseeable future. When the regular service concluded, Reverend Thomas invited those who wished to witness the wedding to remain seated. Nearly everyone did. Deacon Adler and Pearl Zimmerman have come before God and this community to be joined in holy matrimony. The Reverend began once they stood before him at the altar. "While their courtship has been brief, they have assured me of their commitment to building a life together founded on mutual respect and Christian values." Pearl stared straight ahead, acutely aware of Deacon beside her, solid and steady. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding day, yet there was something right about it nonetheless. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional. They exchanged the standard vows to have and to hold for better or worse in sickness and in health. When Deacon slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, where had he gotten it on such short notice? The metal felt warm against her skin. By the power vested in me, Reverend Thomas concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Deacon, you may kiss your bride. Pearl hadn't considered this part of the ceremony. Of course there would be a kiss, it was expected, traditional. She turned to face Deacon, her heart suddenly racing. His eyes met hers, questioning, giving her a chance to pull away. Instead, Pearl gave a small nod. Deacon leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle, warm, and unexpectedly affecting. It lasted only a moment, but Pearl felt it down to her toes. The congregation erupted in applause and well wishes as they turned to face them. Pearl plastered on a smile, still reeling from the kiss and the finality of what they had just done. She was Mrs. Deacon Adler now, at least in the eyes of the law and the community. After accepting congratulations from the townspeople, they emerged from the church into the bright afternoon sunshine. Several families had brought food to share an impromptu wedding celebration that touched Pearl deeply. These people barely knew her, yet they had embraced her as one of their own. As they mingled with the well-wishers, Pearl noticed a rider approaching from the north. The conversations around them quieted as the man drew closer, his dusty appearance suggesting a hard, fast journey. That's one of Thornton's men, Deacon murmured, moving protectively closer to Pearl. The rider pulled up before the gathered crowd, his eyes scanning until they found Pearl. Miss Zimmerman, he called out, ignoring Deacon completely. That's Mrs. Adler now, Deacon corrected firmly. The man's eyes narrowed. Mr. Thornton sends his regards on your nuptials, he said, his tone making it clear these were not congratulations. He also asked me to deliver a message. Whatever Thornton has to say can be said to me directly, Deacon replied. My wife is no longer his concern. The message is simple, the rider continued, still addressing Pearl. Mr. Thornton considers your marriage convenient, too convenient. He believes it to be a ruse and as such considers his prior agreement with you still valid. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, his expression indignant. I just performed this marriage according to the laws of God in this territory. It is legal and binding, the rider shrugged. Mr. Thornton has a different perspective. He tipped his hat mockingly. Madam, enjoy your wedding day. With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Pearl felt suddenly unsteady, the ground seeming to shift beneath her feet. Deacon's arm came around her waist, supporting her. Don't let him spoil today, he said softly. That was just Thornton trying to rattle us. But the damage was done. The celebratory mood had evaporated, replaced by uneasy glances and whispered conversations. Pearl forced herself to smile, to accept the remaining congratulations, but all she could think about was Thornton's message. He wasn't going to accept their marriage as legitimate. The very solution meant to protect her was being dismissed as a deception. The ride back to the ranch was subdued, Pearl lost in troubled thoughts while Deacon maintained a watchful vigilance. When they arrived, the hands discreetly made themselves scarce, giving the newlyweds privacy. Inside, Pearl removed her flower pin and carefully placed it on the mantel. So much for our solution, she said softly. It still has legal standing, Deacon replied. Thornton can believe what he likes, but the law recognizes you as my wife. But he won't stop, Pearl said, voicing her fear. He'll keep coming, causing trouble, maybe even. She couldn't finish the thought. Deacon crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Pearl, look at me. When she did, he continued, I won't let him hurt you. I promise to protect you, and I will. Marriage or no marriage, that hasn't changed. The sincerity in his eyes was overwhelming. Pearl found herself wondering, not for the first time, what it might have been like to meet this man under different circumstances, to court properly, to fall in love gradually, to marry for genuine affection rather than protection. Thank you, she whispered, for everything you've done. Deacon's thumb traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, Pearl thought he might kiss her again, and a part of her hoped he would. Instead, he released her hands and stepped back. You should rest, he said. It's been a long day. Pearl nodded, suddenly uncertain what the protocols of their unusual marriage should be. "Good night, then," she said, turning toward her room. "Pearl," Deacon called after her. When she looked back, he added, "For what it's worth, I'm proud to call you my wife, even if the circumstances are unusual." The words warmed her more than they should have. "Good night, husband," she replied with a small smile before retreating to her room. Alone, Pearl changed out of her wedding dress, carefully hanging it in the small wardrobe. The gold band on her finger caught the lamplight, reminding her of the vows she had spoken that day. For better or worse. The words had more meaning now than when she'd repeated them in church. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and troubled by dreams of Thornton's mocking laughter. The days following the wedding settled into a new routine. Outwardly, little changed. Pearl continued to cook and keep house. Deacon and the hands worked the ranch. But subtle differences marked their new relationship. Deacon would touch her elbow gently when passing in the kitchen, or place his hand briefly on the small of her back when they walked together. Small gestures, proper enough for a newly married couple, yet each sent a flutter through Pearl's chest. They still maintained separate bedrooms, true to Deacon's promise. Yet Pearl found herself increasingly wondering what it would be like to truly be his wife in all ways. These thoughts both frightened and excited her. A week after the wedding, Maria arrived with news from town. "Thornton has been speaking against you both," she reported as she helped Pearl preserve vegetables from the garden, saying the marriage is a fraud, that Deacon stole his bride. Pearl's hands stilled on the knife she was using to slice carrots. "Has anyone believed him?" Maria shrugged. "Some do, some don't. Most people here respect Deacon, but Thornton has money, influence." She glanced toward the window. "Jorge says we should be careful. Thornton is not a man who forgets." That evening, Pearl shared Maria's warning with Deacon as they sat together after dinner. The hands had gone to the bunkhouse, leaving them alone in the quiet house. "We knew he wouldn't give up easily," Deacon said, his expression grim. "But spreading rumors is one thing, taking action would be another." "What kind of action do you think he might take?" Pearl asked, anxiety tightening her chest. Deacon hesitated. "I don't want to frighten you." "I need to know," Pearl insisted. "Please. He might try to discredit me in town, turn opinion against us. Or," Deacon paused, "he might try to remove me from the equation entirely." The implication was clear. "You think he would try to harm you? It's possible." Deacon's tone was matter of fact. "Men like Thornton believe they're above the law. If he truly believes I've stolen something that belongs to him, he might see violence as justified." Pearl stood abruptly, pacing the small sitting room. "This is madness, all because I changed my mind about marrying a man I'd never even met." "It's not about you, not really," Deacon said quietly. "It's about control, power. Thornton can't stand losing either." "And I'm just a possession to be fought over," Pearl said bitterly. Deacon rose, catching her hand as she passed. "Not to me," he said firmly. "Never to me." The intensity in his eyes took her breath away. Without thinking, Pearl reached up to touch his face, her fingertips tracing the strong line of his jaw. Deacon went very still under her touch, his breathing quickening slightly. "Pearl," he murmured, his voice rough. "What are you doing?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I just wanted to." His hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "This wasn't part of our arrangement," he reminded her gently. "I know." Pearl moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Maybe I want more than we arranged." For a long moment, Deacon simply looked at her, searching her eyes as though trying to read her thoughts. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lowered his head and kissed her, not the brief, chaste kiss of their wedding ceremony, but something deeper, more genuine. Pearl responded eagerly, her arms winding around his neck. This was what she had been wondering about, dreaming of the feel of Deacon's strong arms around her, the taste of him, the warmth that spread through her body at his touch. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Deacon rested his forehead against hers. "Are you certain?" he asked softly. "This changes things between us." "I know," Pearl replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I want it to change." Deacon studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. Taking her hand, he led her toward his bedroom, a room Pearl had never entered, having always respected his privacy as he respected hers. Inside, a lamp burned low on the bedside table. casting golden light across the simple furnishings. Deacon closed the door behind them, then turned to face her, his expression a mix of desire and uncertainty. "We can stop at any time," he assured her. "Just say the word." Pearl nodded, grateful for his consideration even as she knew she didn't want to stop. Since their first meeting on that dusty road, something had been building between them, an attraction that went beyond the practical reasons for their marriage. They came together again, kisses growing more urgent as hands began to explore. Deacon was gentle but thorough, his touch reverent as he helped Pearl out of her dress, his eyes darkening with appreciation as more of her skin was revealed. Pearl had been raised with proper Boston modesty, but there was nothing shameful in the way Deacon looked at her like she was precious, beautiful, desired. She helped him remove his own clothing, her fingers trembling slightly with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. When they finally lay together on Deacon's bed, skin to skin, Pearl felt a rightness she hadn't expected. Their bodies fit together perfectly, as though made for each other. Deacon took his time, ensuring her comfort and pleasure before seeking his own, his whispered endearments making her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before. Afterward, lying in the circle of Deacon's arms, Pearl felt a profound sense of peace despite the dangers still lurking beyond their door. Whatever Thornton might try, whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Deacon would face them together not just as partners in a convenient arrangement, but as true husband and wife. "I never expected this," Deacon murmured against her hair. "When I offered you protection that day, I never imagined." "Nor did I," Pearl admitted, nestling closer against his chest, "but I'm glad it happened." "So am I," Deacon's arms tightened around her. "More than I can say." They drifted off to sleep together, the gold bands on their fingers catching the last flicker of lamplight before darkness claimed the room. The next morning brought a new intimacy to their relationship. Pearl woke first, momentarily disoriented to find herself in Deacon's bed, his arm draped heavily across her waist. The events of the previous night rushed back, bringing a flush to her cheeks and a smile to her lips. Careful not to wake him, Pearl studied her husband's sleeping face. Relaxed in slumber, he looked younger, the lines of worry that often creased his forehead smoothed away. She resisted the urge to trace them with her fingertip, content for now just to watch him. Eventually, Deacon stirred, his eyes opening slowly to find Pearl beside him. A smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his features. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Pearl replied softly. "No regrets?" he asked, suddenly serious. Pearl shook her head. "None." Relief flickered in his eyes before he leaned forward to kiss her lightly. "I should get up. The men will be wondering where I am." Reluctantly, they rose and dressed. Pearl returned briefly to her own room to fix her hair and change into fresh clothes, aware that the hands would certainly notice if she emerged from Deacon's bedroom in yesterday's dress. The day proceeded much like any other, though there was a new warmth in the glances Deacon sent her way, a new intimacy in the casual touches they exchanged. If the hands noticed the shift in their relationship, they had the good grace not to comment, though Pearl caught Charlie grinning knowingly when Deacon's hand lingered on her shoulder during breakfast. That afternoon, as Pearl hung laundry while Deacon and the men worked in the east pasture, a rider approached from the direction of town. Pearl shaded her eyes, recognizing Mr. Peterson from the general store. "Mrs. Adler," he called out, dismounting quickly. "Is your husband about?" "He's out with the cattle," Pearl replied, concern rising at the man's agitated manner. "What's wrong?" Peterson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable delivering his news to her instead of Deacon. "It's Thornton," he finally said. "He's filed a complaint with the territorial marshal, claiming Deacon coerced you into marriage to void a prior contract." Pearl's blood ran cold. "That's absurd." "Yes, madam, I believe you, but the marshal's obliged to investigate any formal complaint." Peterson twisted his hat in his hands. "Thornton's demanding the marshal annul your marriage and enforce his agreement with you." "On what grounds?" Pearl demanded, anger replacing her initial shock. "Claims you accepted his money and promised to be his bride, says Deacon interfered unlawfully." Peterson glanced nervously toward the pasture. Marshals riding in from Fort Smith tomorrow. Thought Deacon should know, have time to prepare. Pearl thanked him for the warning, promising to relay the message to Deacon immediately. After Peterson left, she stood motionless for a long moment, the damp sheet she'd been about to hang forgotten in her hands. A legal challenge. She hadn't considered this possibility. If the marshal sided with Thornton, could he truly force her to honor the mail order arrangement? Surely not. She was a free woman, not property to be bartered. Yet frontier justice sometimes operated by its own rules, especially when influential men like Thornton were involved. When Deacon returned an hour later, Pearl told him Peterson's news. His reaction was grim but unsurprised. "We knew he'd try something," he said, pacing the kitchen as Pearl prepared dinner. "I just didn't expect him to involve the law so directly." "What will happen?" Pearl asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. "The marshal will come, hear both sides. He's a fair man from what I've heard." Deacon ran a hand through his hair. "But Thornton will have painted himself as the wronged party. It'll be our word against his." "I have the letters he sent me," Pearl offered, "the one with the threats. Would that help our case?" Deacon paused. "It might. At the very least, it shows you had reason to reconsider the arrangement." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Pearl, I need to ask you something important." She looked up at him, waiting. If the marshal questions us, he'll want to know if our marriage is genuine. "Thornton is claiming it's a fraud, just a way to void your agreement with him." Deacon's grip tightened slightly. "I need to know what to tell him." The question caught Pearl off guard. What was their marriage now? It had begun as an arrangement of convenience, certainly. But last night had changed things between them. The way Deacon looked at her, touched her. Those weren't the actions of a man merely honoring a business agreement. "Tell him the truth," she finally said. "That it may have started as a practical solution, but it's become something more." Relief softened Deacon's features. "Has it?" he asked softly. Pearl nodded, surprised by the certainty she felt. "Yes, for me at least. For me as well," Deacon admitted, drawing her into his arms, "more than I ever expected." They held each other for a long moment, the reality of what they'd just acknowledged settling around them like a comfortable blanket. Whatever had driven them together initially, something genuine had grown in the fertile soil of their arrangement. "We'll face this together," Deacon promised. "And whatever happens with the marshal, know that he broke off, as though uncertain whether to continue. Pearl looked up at him questioningly. "That I've come to care for you," he finished. "Very much." The words weren't quite a declaration of love, but they warmed Pearl nonetheless. "And I for you," she replied softly. That night, Pearl moved her few belongings into Deacon's room, a visible statement of their commitment should the marshal come calling. They made love with a new tenderness, both aware that the fragile happiness they'd found together was under threat. Marshal Wilson arrived the following afternoon, a weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened carefully as Deacon explained the situation, Pearl seated beside her husband on the sofa. "Let me be sure I understand," the marshal said when Deacon finished. "Miss Zimmerman, excuse me, Mrs. Adler agreed to be a mail-order bride to Elijah Thornton. During her journey, she encountered you, Mr. Adler, who warned her about Thornton's reputation. She then chose to break her agreement with Thornton and subsequently married you." "That's correct," Deacon confirmed. "And you claim this marriage is genuine, not simply a legal maneuver to void the prior agreement." Pearl spoke up before Deacon could answer. "Marshal Wilson, I have something I'd like you to see." She retrieved Thornton's letters from her dresser drawer, handing them to the lawman. "These are the letters Mr. Thornton sent me, particularly the last one." The marshal read through them slowly, his expression darkening at certain passages. When he reached the final letter with its thinly veiled threat, his eyebrows rose significantly. "I see," he said, returning the letters to Pearl. "And this influenced your decision to break the agreement?" "Yes," Pearl admitted. "I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I was desperate to escape Boston, to start a new life. Mr. Thornton's initial letters seemed kind, respectable, but the more we corresponded, the more controlling he became." She glanced at Deacon. "When Mr. Adler confirmed his reputation for cruelty, I knew I couldn't go through with it." "And your marriage?" the marshal asked. Thornton claims it's a sham arranged solely to circumvent your obligation to him. It began as a solution to a problem, Deacon acknowledged, but it's become much more than that. He took Pearl's hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. We care for each other. We share a home, a bed, a life. The marshal studied them thoughtfully. Mrs. Adler, I need to speak with you alone. Deacon tensed but nodded, rising to leave. I'll be just outside, he told Pearl, squeezing her hand once before departing. When they were alone, Marshal Wilson leaned forward. Mrs. Adler, you can speak freely now. Are you here of your own free will? Has Adler coerced or threatened you in any way? Absolutely not, Pearl replied firmly. Deacon has been nothing but respectful and kind. He offered me a choice when Mr. Thornton would have given me none. And your feelings for him are genuine, Pearl met the marshal's searching gaze directly. Yes, they've grown with time, but they're real. The marshal nodded, apparently satisfied. One last question. If I were to rule that your agreement with Thornton takes precedence over your marriage, what would you do? I would refuse, Pearl said without hesitation. I am a free woman, Marshal Wilson, not property to be handed from one man to another. I chose to marry Deacon Adler, and no law or ruling will force me to go to a man who threatened me before we even met. A slight smile crossed the marshal's weathered face. That's what I thought you'd say. He rose, calling for Deacon to return. Mr. Adler, I've heard enough. Deacon re-entered, his expression guarded as he took his place beside Pearl. I'll be straight with you both, the marshal said. The law regarding mail order arrangements is unclear. They're not formal contracts in the legal sense, more like promises of intent. He gestured to the letters Pearl had shown him. However, these letters make it clear that Thornton's intentions toward Mrs. Adler were concerning at best, threatening at worst. Hope began to rise in Pearl's chest. More importantly, the marshal continued, I believe your marriage is genuine. The law recognizes a valid marriage performed by an ordained minister before witnesses. That takes precedence over any informal agreement that came before it. So Thornton has no claim on Pearl? Deacon asked, his arm sliding protectively around her shoulders. None that the law will uphold, the marshal confirmed. I'll inform him of my decision. He won't like it, but he'll have to accept it. Relief washed over Pearl, leaving her lightheaded. Thank you, Marshal Wilson. Don't thank me yet, the lawman cautioned. Thornton isn't known for taking disappointment well. I'd advise you both to remain vigilant. I can only enforce the law. I can't prevent a man from holding a grudge. After the marshal left, promising to speak with Thornton immediately, Pearl and Deacon held each other in silent gratitude. They had won this battle, but both knew the larger conflict might not be over. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Pearl found herself studying Deacon's face in the lamplight, memorizing every line and plane as though she might lose him at any moment. What are you thinking? He asked, catching her gaze. That I'm luckier than I deserve, she replied honestly. A month ago, I was alone in Boston, making a desperate choice that nearly led me to disaster. Now I'm here with you, and despite everything with Thornton, I've never been happier. Deacon crossed to her, taking her face gently between his hands. Pearl Adler, I have something to tell you, something I should have said before the marshal arrived. Her heart quickened at his serious tone. I love you, he said simply. What began as protection has become the most important thing in my life. I need you to know that, whatever happens. Tears pricked at Pearl's eyes. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have almost from the beginning. Their kiss was tender, a seal on the declaration they'd just shared. Whatever Thornton might still attempt, they would face it together, their connection no longer a matter of convenience but of deep, abiding love. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect late spring day that seemed at odds with the tension still hovering over the ranch. Deacon and the hands kept weapons close at hand as they went about their work, alert for any sign of trouble from Thornton's direction. Pearl busied herself with household tasks, determined not to let fear rule her days. She was kneading bread dough when Charlie burst through the kitchen door, breathless and wide-eyed. Riders coming, he gasped. At least 6 men, Thornton's with them, Pearl's hands stilled in the dough. Where's Deacon? By the north fence with Jorge, Hank's riding to warn them. Heart pounding, Pearl wiped her hands on her apron. What do they want? Charlie shook his head. Nothing good, madam. They're armed. Pearl moved to the cabinet where Deacon kept his spare revolver. Go help Hank warn the others, she instructed Charlie. I'll be fine. After the young cowhand left, Pearl loaded the revolver with steady hands. The marshal's ruling should have settled matters legally, but Pearl had expected Thornton to retaliate in some way. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. Through the kitchen window, she could see dust rising on the horizon, the approaching riders. Closer, she spotted Deacon and Jorge racing back toward the house, Hank close behind. At least they'd been warned. When Deacon burst through the door minutes later, his expression was grim. Stay inside, he ordered. No matter what happens. What are they here for? Pearl asked. Nothing they're going to get, Deacon replied grimly, checking his own weapon. The marshal already ruled. Thornton has no legal claim on you. This isn't about legality anymore, Pearl said quietly. Is it? Deacon's silence was answer enough. The riders pulled up in the yard, spread out in a half circle facing the house. Thornton sat on a large black stallion at the center, a tall, imposing man with iron gray hair and cold eyes that scanned the property with proprietary interest. Adler. He called out, "Come face me like a man." Deacon moved to the door. "Stay here," he repeated to Pearl. "Be careful," she whispered, fear clutching at her heart. With a quick nod, Deacon stepped outside, Jorge and the other hands flanking him. Pearl moved to the window, revolver gripped tightly, watching the confrontation unfold. "What do you want, Thornton?" Deacon called, his stance relaxed but ready. "You know what I want," Thornton replied. "The marshal may have been fooled by your sham marriage, but I wasn't. The woman was promised to me. I paid good money for her passage west. The money will be repaid," Deacon said evenly. "Pearl is my wife now, legally and in truth. Go home." Thornton's laugh was ugly. "Your wife, a convenient fiction. Tell me, Adler, does she know about your obsession with my affairs? How you've been trying to pin your sister's desertion on me for years?" "Sarah didn't desert anyone," Deacon replied, his voice hardening. "She wrote to me about your cruelty. She was planning to leave you, yes, but she never would have disappeared without a word to me." "Yet no body was ever found," Thornton taunted. "No evidence of foul play, just the ravings of a brother who couldn't accept that his precious sister preferred a salesman's company to mine." Pearl watched Deacon's posture stiffen, his hand inching closer to his holster. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Thornton was clearly trying to provoke Deacon into drawing first a move that would justify retaliation. Making a split-second decision, Pearl set down the revolver and stepped outside, ignoring Deacon's look of alarm. "Mr. Thornton," she called clearly, moving to stand beside her husband. "I believe we haven't been formally introduced." Thornton's cold gaze shifted to her, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. "Miss Zimmerman, a pleasure at last." "Mrs. Adler," Pearl corrected firmly, "and the pleasure is not mutual." "A temporary condition, your marriage," Thornton replied dismissively. "One I intend to remedy today." "The marshal has ruled," Pearl reminded him. "Our marriage is legal and binding. Whatever arrangement you thought we had was never finalized. Arrangements can be renegotiated when certain parties are no longer in the picture," Thornton said, his meaning unmistakable as he glanced at Deacon. Pearl's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Thornton, let me be very clear. I would never marry you under any circumstances. Not if Deacon were gone, not if I were the last woman in the territory. Your letters revealed your true character long before we met." Thornton's expression darkened. "You do well to watch your tone, woman." "And you do well to leave my property," Deacon interjected, his arm moving protectively in front of Pearl. "The marshal's ruling is final. Pearl stays with me." For a tense moment, Thornton seemed to consider his options, his men shifting restlessly behind him. Then, to Pearl's surprise, he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent a shiver down her spine. "Very well," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "You win this round, Adler. Keep your mail-order bride. She wasn't worth this much trouble anyway." The easy capitulation was suspicious. Pearl glanced at Deacon, seeing her own doubt reflected in his eyes. "Just like that?" Deacon asked skeptically. "Just like that," Thornton confirmed. "But remember this, Adler, our business isn't finished, not by a long shot." With that ominous declaration, Thornton wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. Pearl and Deacon watched until the riders disappeared over the horizon, both aware that this retreat was tactical rather than final. "He's planning something," Deacon said quietly as they returned inside. "That was too easy." "What do we do now?" Pearl asked. Deacon sighed heavily. "We stay alert, and I think it's time I told you everything about Sarah, what really happened, what I suspect Thornton did to her." Over coffee at the kitchen table, Deacon finally shared the full story of his sister's disappearance. Sarah had married Thornton 3 years earlier, a young woman dazzled by his wealth and charm. But within months, her letters to Deacon had changed, describing Thornton's controlling behavior, his fits of rage, his threats. "The last letter I received," Deacon said, staring into his coffee cup. "Sarah mentioned a hidden box where she'd been documenting everything, a diary of sorts, along with a small amount of money she'd managed to save. She was planning to leave him the following week, to come stay with me in Colorado where I was working at the time. But she never arrived," Pearl guessed. Deacon nodded grimly. "I waited 2 weeks before riding to Thornton's ranch. He claimed she'd run off with a salesman who'd stayed at their ranch, said they'd taken money from his safe, headed west, but it didn't fit with Sarah's letter with her plan to come to me." "Did you find the box she mentioned?" Pearl asked. "That's just it, I couldn't search properly. Thornton wouldn't let me in the house except briefly, with him present the whole time. I've always believed the answers are there in that box if it still exists." "You think he killed her?" Pearl said softly. "It wasn't a question." "I do. But without evidence, it's just the accusation of a grieving brother." Deacon met Pearl's gaze directly. "That's why I settled here, so close to Thornton. I've been waiting for an opportunity to find that box, to learn the truth. And then I came along," Pearl murmured. "I never expected to feel this way about you," Deacon admitted. "When I offered you protection that day, it was partly to thwart Thornton, yes, but as I've come to know you, to love you." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "Finding the truth about Sarah is still important to me, but not at the cost of your safety. If you want to leave, to go somewhere Thornton can't reach us—" "No," Pearl interrupted firmly. "I won't let him drive us from our home. And I won't let him get away with what he did to Sarah, if your suspicions are correct." Determination hardened her voice as she continued. "We need to find that box." The opportunity came sooner than either expected. 2 days later, Jorge returned from town with news that Thornton had traveled to Fort Smith on business, leaving his ranch with a skeleton crew of hands. "He'll be gone at least 3 days," Jorge reported. "Maybe longer." Pearl and Deacon exchanged a meaningful glance. This could be their chance to search for Sarah's box and with it, the truth about her disappearance. That night, they made their plans. Deacon and Pearl would ride to Thornton's ranch the following day, under the pretense of repaying the money he'd sent for Pearl's passage west. While Deacon distracted whoever was left in charge, Pearl would slip into the main house to search for Sarah's hidden box. It was dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but the alternative, living under the constant shadow of Thornton's threats, seemed worse. The next morning dawned overcast and threatening rain, whether that matched their somber mood. They rode out early, Deacon leading the way along trails that skirted the main road to avoid being seen. Pearl wore her sturdiest riding clothes, her hair tucked up under a hat to make her less immediately recognizable at a distance. Thornton's ranch was impressive, larger than Deacon's, with a 2-story main house painted pristine white, extensive outbuildings, and vast pastures dotted with prime cattle. Power and wealth were evident in every aspect of the property. Where would Sarah have hidden the box? Pearl asked as they approached. In her letter, she mentioned beneath the loose board where sunshine meets shadow, Deacon replied. I've never been certain what she meant. Somewhere in the house, certainly, but where exactly? They slowed their horses as they neared the main house. 2 men were visible in the yard, one working on a saddle on the porch, another mucking out the nearby stable. Both looked up as Deacon and Pearl approached. That's far enough, called the man on the porch, setting aside his work and standing. Mr. Thornton ain't here. We know, Deacon replied easily, reining in his horse. We've come to settle a debt. I have money owed to Thornton. The man's suspicion was evident, but the mention of money caught his attention. "What kind of debt?" "Passage fare," Deacon explained, gesturing to Pearl. "For my wife." "There was a misunderstanding about her arrival. We want to clear it up properly." The man studied them for a moment, then nodded grudgingly. "Wait here. I'll get Simmons. He's in charge while the boss is away." As the man disappeared into the house, Deacon murmured to Pearl, "When I'm talking with Simmons, make your way around back. Look for a way in, and be careful." Pearl nodded, her heart racing. The plan was in motion now, there was no turning back. Simmons emerged, a burly, bearded man with suspicious eyes. "Adler," he grunted. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Just settling accounts," Deacon replied, dismounting and reaching into his pocket for the money he'd brought. "Thornton paid for my wife's passage west. We're returning the funds." As Deacon engaged Simmons in conversation, deliberately drawing him and the other men toward the corral with questions about a particularly fine stallion, Pearl slipped from her horse and moved casually toward the side of the house, as though simply stretching her legs after the long ride. Once out of sight, she quickened her pace, circling to the back of the house where a kitchen door stood partially open. Listening carefully for any sound of servants inside, Pearl eased through the doorway. The kitchen was empty, a pot of something simmering unattended on the stove. Pearl moved quickly through it into a large dining room, then a formal parlor. The house was opulently furnished, rich carpets, heavy drapes, furniture that must have been shipped at great expense from the east. Where would Sarah have hidden her box? "Where sunshine meets shadow," Deacon had said. Pearl scanned the rooms, trying to interpret the cryptic clue. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Someone else was in the house. Ducking into a small study off the main parlor, Pearl held her breath, listening. Footsteps crossed above her, then receded. A servant, perhaps, or one of Thornton's men. The study was dark, heavy curtains drawn against the threatening weather outside. Pearl's gaze swept the room, a massive desk, bookshelves, a small hearth. And there in the corner, a bay window with a built-in window seat. Pearl moved closer. The window faced east, she realized, and when the sun rose, light would stream in, but the deep alcove meant part of the window seat would remain in shadow even while the rest was illuminated. Where sunshine meets shadow. Heart pounding, Pearl knelt beside the window seat. It was a wooden box structure with a hinged lid, likely used for storage. She lifted the cushioned top, finding linens inside. Disappointing, but then she noticed the bottom of the compartment didn't quite match the dimensions of the window seat itself. Removing the linens, Pearl pressed against the wooden panels of the compartment's floor. One moved slightly under her touch. A loose board, just as Sarah had described. With trembling fingers, Pearl pried up the board, revealing a small space beneath. And there, wrapped in oilskin, was a package about the size of a cigar box. She had found it. Quickly rewrapping the package in the oilskin, Pearl tucked it inside her jacket. She replaced the board, arranged the linens as she'd found them, and closed the window seat. Now she just needed to slip back outside without being discovered. Moving stealthily through the house, Pearl made her way back toward the kitchen. She had nearly reached it when a door opened directly in her path, and a young maid stepped out with a basket of laundry. The girl gasped, nearly dropping her basket. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What are you doing in here?" "I'm looking for the washroom," Pearl improvised quickly. "My husband is outside speaking with Mr. Simmons. I've been riding since dawn and needed to refresh myself." The maid looked suspicious but slightly mollified. "Washroom's upstairs, madam. This here's just the kitchen way." "Oh, thank you," Pearl said with feigned embarrassment. "I must have taken a wrong turn. I'll just go back to the front hall and find my way from there." Before the maid could respond, Pearl turned and walked purposefully in the opposite direction, praying the girl wouldn't raise an alarm. She circled through the dining room and parlor, then slipped out the front door while Simmons and the others were still occupied with Deacon at the corral. Keeping her pace measured despite her pounding heart, Pearl made her way back to her horse. She had just reached it when Deacon spotted her, giving a nearly imperceptible nod. "Well, Simmons, thanks for your time," he said, smoothly concluding their conversation. "Please see that Thornton gets this money. Tell him our accounts are now settled in full." Simmons accepted the payment with a grunt. "I'll tell him, though I doubt this ends matters between you two." That's between Thornton and me, Deacon replied evenly, mounting his horse. Good day to you. They rode away at a deliberately unhurried pace, aware of being watched until they crested the hill that would take them out of sight of the ranch. Once over it, Deacon urged his horse closer to Pearl's. Did you find it? He asked quietly. Pearl nodded, patting her jacket where the package was concealed. I think so. Something hidden exactly where you described. Relief and anticipation mingled in Deacon's expression. Let's get home before this rain starts, then we'll see what Sarah left behind. The first fat drops began to fall as they reached the halfway point home, quickly becoming a steady downpour that soaked them both. By the time they reached the ranch, they were drenched and chilled but exhilarated by the success of their mission. Inside, Pearl carefully removed the oilskin package while Deacon built up the fire. Together, they unwrapped it to reveal a small wooden box and beside it, a leather-bound journal. Sarah's diary, Deacon said softly, touching the journal with reverent fingers. She always kept one, even as a girl. Pearl opened the box first, finding a small amount of money, perhaps $40 in bills and coins, and a folded document that proved to be a deed to a small plot of land near Denver, apparently purchased in Sarah's maiden name without Thornton's knowledge. She was planning carefully, Pearl observed. Saving money, securing a place to go. Deacon nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and grief. Sarah was always smart, methodical. The diary revealed the full extent of Thornton's cruelty, detailed accounts of verbal abuse escalating to physical violence, of Sarah's growing fear and her determination to escape. The final entry, dated just 2 days before her disappearance, was chilling in its clarity. Elijah found the bruises today. He knows I've been speaking to Dr. Miller about them. He was coldly furious, warning me that doctors can be mistaken about what they've seen. I fear what he might do. Tomorrow I will send my final letter to Deacon, and the day after, I'll take the morning stage while Elijah is in town. I pray I am not too late. Deacon's hands were shaking as he finished reading the entry aloud. She never made it to that stage, he said quietly. Thornton must have discovered her plan. The diary alone isn't proof he harmed her, Pearl said gently, but it establishes his pattern of abuse, her fear of him. There's more, Deacon replied, turning the pages further. Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded sheet of paper, a letter from Dr. Miller, confirming he had treated Sarah for injuries consistent with physical abuse, and that he had advised her to leave her husband for her own safety. This is evidence, Pearl said. Not of murder, perhaps, but certainly of the abuse Sarah suffered, combined with her disappearance. It might be enough to convince the marshal to investigate more thoroughly, Deacon finished, to search Thornton's property, perhaps. They spent hours poring over the diary, piecing together Sarah's final days. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking: a young woman trapped in a violent marriage, systematically isolated from friends and family, planning her escape with meticulous care only to vanish before she could implement it. We need to take this to Marshal Wilson, Pearl finally said as the clock struck midnight. First thing tomorrow. Deacon nodded, carefully returning the diary and other items to their oilskin wrapping. Whatever happens with Thornton, Sarah deserves justice. And you deserve to be free of his threats once and for all. They rode to Whispering Creek the next morning, the precious package secured inside Deacon's jacket. The marshal listened gravely as they presented Sarah's diary, the doctor's letter, and their theory about her disappearance. This is serious evidence of abuse, he acknowledged, studying the documents, and suspicious circumstances surrounding her disappearance, enough to warrant a more thorough investigation than was conducted at the time. Will you search Thornton's property? Deacon asked, barely containing his eagerness. The marshal nodded slowly. I'll need to send for assistance deputies from Fort Smith, and we'll need to wait until Thornton returns. I want him present when we execute the search. He returns tomorrow or the next day, Pearl informed him. Then we'll move the day after that, the marshal decided. In the meantime, keep this information to yourselves. Thornton has friends in these parts. I don't want him warned before we can act. The wait was agonizing. Pearl and Deacon returned to the ranch, going through the motions of normal daily activities while anticipation and anxiety simmered beneath the surface. If the marshals' search uncovered evidence of foul play in Sarah's disappearance, Thornton would face justice at last. If not, he would know they had invaded his home, taken Sarah's diary, and his retribution would likely be swift and terrible. 2 days later, word came that Thornton had returned to his ranch. The marshal rode out that afternoon with 3 deputies, informing Deacon and Pearl that they would execute the search warrant the following morning. "I want to be there," Deacon insisted when the marshal stopped by their ranch on his way to town. Marshal Wilson considered this request, then nodded. "You have that right as Sarah's brother, but Mrs. Adler should remain here. No sense putting you both at risk." Pearl opened her mouth to protest, but Deacon squeezed her hand. "The marshal's right," he said softly. "I need to know you're safe." Reluctantly, Pearl agreed to stay behind while Deacon accompanied the lawmen to Thornton's ranch the next day. That night, they held each other close, both aware of the potential dangers the morning would bring. "Be careful," Pearl whispered in the darkness. "Thornton will be desperate if he thinks he's about to be exposed." "I will," Deacon promised. "And when this is over, when Thornton can no longer threaten us, we can truly begin our life together." "We already have," Pearl replied, touching his face tenderly. "Whatever happens tomorrow doesn't change what's grown between us." Deacon rode out with the marshal at dawn, leaving Pearl to wait in anxious silence. The hands went about their chores, clearly aware that something significant was happening but respectful enough not to pry. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Pearl tried to occupy herself with household tasks, but found herself constantly returning to the window, watching the road for any sign of Deacon's return. It was nearly sunset when she finally spotted riders approaching more than she expected, a group of at least 8 men. As they drew closer, Pearl recognized Deacon among them, riding alongside the marshal. Behind them, a man with his hands bound to his saddle horn Thornton, she realized with a surge of hope. She rushed outside as they reached the yard, her eyes seeking Deacon's. The expression on his face told her everything she needed to know even before he dismounted and gathered her into his arms. "They found her," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "In an old well behind the stables. It had been filled in, but not entirely. They found remains. And the necklace I gave her for her 18th birthday. It's Sarah." Pearl held him tightly, feeling the shudders that ran through his body, grief and relief intermingled. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "and so glad you finally know." Marshal Wilson approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Adler, I'm afraid we need to impose on your hospitality. It's too late to make it back to town, and we can't risk camping with our prisoner." Pearl glanced at Thornton, still mounted, his face a mask of cold fury. Armed deputies flanked him on either side. "Of course," she replied. "We have room in the barn for the men, and—" She hesitated, looking at Thornton with undisguised revulsion. "I suppose the root cellar has a strong door. He can be secured there for the night." "Thank you, madam," the marshal said. "We'll handle everything. Your husband's been through enough today." As the deputies led Thornton away, his eyes met Pearl's for a brief, chilling moment. There was no remorse there, only thwarted rage and hatred. Pearl turned away, focusing instead on Deacon, who seemed simultaneously exhausted and energized by the day's discoveries. That night, after the ranch had finally quieted, Deacon told Pearl everything. How the search had initially found nothing, how Thornton had grown increasingly confident and mocking as the hours passed. Then one of the deputies had noticed irregularities in the ground near an old, supposedly dry well behind the stables. Thornton tried to stop them from digging, Deacon said, his voice hollow with remembered tension. Said it was just an old well that had been filled in years ago, before he even bought the property. But the marshal insisted. It had taken hours of digging before they made their grim discovery: human remains buried beneath soil and rocks. And with them, the distinctive silver locket that Deacon had given Sarah years earlier. Thornton denied everything, of course, Deacon continued. Claimed he had no idea she was there, that she must have fallen in by accident. But with the diary, the doctor's letter, his attempt to stop the search, the marshal arrested him on the spot. "What happens now?" Pearl asked gently. "A trial, eventually. The marshal says there's more than enough evidence for a murder charge." Deacon's expression was somber but determined. Sarah will finally have justice, and they would finally be free of Thornton's shadow, Pearl realized, free to build the life together that had begun in such unusual circumstances but had blossomed into something true and lasting. "I love you," she said simply, taking his hand. "And I love you," Deacon replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "More than I ever thought possible when I offered you protection that day on the stagecoach road. It seems like a lifetime ago," Pearl mused. "In some ways it was," Deacon agreed. "We've both changed, grown." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire slowly die down to embers. Tomorrow, Thornton would be taken to Fort Smith to await trial. The threat he represented would be removed from their lives, though the grief of Sarah's confirmed death would take longer to heal. But they would face it together, Pearl knew. As partners, as husband and wife, no longer a marriage of convenience, but one of deep and abiding love. In the years that followed, Thornton's trial and conviction for the murder of Sarah Adler became something of a legend in the territory. He was sentenced to hang, justice finally served for the young woman who had suffered at his hands. The case even made Eastern newspapers, cited as evidence that the frontier justice system was evolving, becoming more responsive to crimes against women. For Pearl and Deacon, however, the most significant outcome was the freedom to live their lives without fear. Their ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding as they purchased adjacent land, including the property that had once belonged to Thornton, which was sold at auction after his conviction. 2 years after their wedding, Pearl gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, in honor of the sister Deacon had lost and finally laid to rest. A son followed 2 years later, then another daughter, their family growing alongside their ranch. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Pearl and Deacon stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the setting sun painted the prairie in gold and amber. "Do you ever think about how we started?" Pearl asked, leaning against Deacon's shoulder. "How different things might have been if our paths hadn't crossed that day." "I try not to," Deacon admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. "The thought of you with Thornton, or the thought of never finding Sarah," Pearl finished gently. He nodded. "I prefer to think about how fortunate we've been since, despite the difficult beginning." Pearl smiled, turning in his arms to face him. "A mail-order bride who found love in an unexpected place," she mused. "Not the story I imagined when I left Boston, but a far better one." "Better than either of us could have written for ourselves," Deacon agreed, leaning down to kiss her with the same tenderness he'd shown from the beginning, a tenderness that had only deepened with the passing years. As dusk settled over the prairie, they called their children in for supper, the scene of domestic happiness, a far cry from the danger and uncertainty that had marked their first days together. What had begun as a practical arrangement to escape a threatening stranger had blossomed into a love story. Neither could have anticipated proof that sometimes the most beautiful endings grew from the most unlikely beginnings. And as they gathered around their table, a family bound by love rather than convention, Pearl silently thanked whatever fate or providence had led her to break her agreement with one man and find happiness with another. The mail-order bride had indeed been promised to a stranger she feared, but the cowboy who broke that agreement had given her something far more precious than security. He had given her a life filled with love, purpose, and joy.